Hello and welcome to another video on the PS Puppet channel. My name is Isabel and today we're going to be talking about some neuroanatomy. So this isn't going to be a super in-depth dive into neuroanatomy or anything like that. The main purpose of this video is because I remember sitting there in second year, especially on Zoom. You can't see any of these structures in person, staring at the screen of 2D pictures thinking, what on earth am I looking at? What is happening in this image? And how does this actually look in 3D in real life? So today I'm going to be taking you with me while we take a look at a 3D anatomy model and have a chat about some of the anatomy that we're looking at. And hopefully this just helps demystify it a little bit and make it make a bit more sense. So we're going to start off with the dural folds. The dural folds are folds of the dura mater, which is the most outside covering of your brain. And basically, if you took that and shoved it in between the big gaps in the brain, you get your dural folds. And I remember looking this super confused at what I was looking at. I'm like, what do you mean folds? So let's take a look at our 3D model. So here we've got a beautiful 3D model of the brain and the dura. So here we have our dura mater. And if we remove this half of the brain, we can see here our dural folds. So we have firstly the falx cerebri, and secondly the tentorium cerebelli. Now they are very annoying names. The main way I remembered it was cerebri versus cerebelli, because the tentorium cerebelli basically separates the cerebellum from the rest of the brain. Not actually separate, but it forms a sort of barrier between the cerebellum and the rest of the brain, with the rest of the brain being the cerebrum. So the falx cerebri kind of sits around the cerebrum, the main part of your brain, and the cerebelli sits near your cerebellum. So that's how I like to remember where they are and which one is which. Another way you can remember is that the falx cerebri, falx apparently means sickle, and it's kind of sickle shaped. So if that's the way you like to remember it, then you can. And if we get rid of the dural venous sinuses here, which run in these dural folds, you can see how it really does just dive straight in there. Yeah. And if you look from the back, you can see that they basically make a cross on through the brain. They quarter the brain, essentially. So that is our dural folds. And they just provide a little bit more structure, keep everything in place. But, things don't always stay in place. And that's what we're going to be talking about next, herniations. So you've probably seen this picture before. And essentially, if the brain is put under any kind of pressure, it is within this brain skull box, really. It doesn't have anywhere to go. So it just shifts itself around within its space to try and stay in there. The main two herniations you're going to need to know are your subfalcine herniations and your tonsillar herniations. So subfalcine herniations are what they sound like. So underneath the falx. So we are looking at the brain in a coronal plane here. So if we took this, we chopped it right down the middle like that, and we're looking through the back, kind of like that. So you can see that's the falx, and that is your tentorium cerebelli. So the brain is just shoving its way underneath the falx cerebri because there's this big mass here. So the mass can be a hemorrhage like it is here. It can be a tumor. It could be edema from like an infection or inflammation, so like meningitis or encephalitis. All these things can increase the intracranial pressure and cause herniations to happen. So subfalcine ones are probably the easiest to see on a CT and probably the only one you'd ever be expected to see at this stage. And for example, here, you can see your ventricles are nowhere near the midline, which is where they should be, which suggests massive midline shift. And when there's midline shift, it means that there's been a subfalcine herniation, because there is no other way for the brain to make its way all the way over there without having gone under this structure, really. So midline shift, big red flag, really, really bad sign. They probably have some sort of fluid over in this corner that's squishing everything across. Always pick up a midline shift. Now, secondly, you have your tonsillar herniations. Now, that may sound like an unfamiliar word. A more familiar word may be coning. So coning is a really dangerous, life-threatening thing that you really don't want to happen. Basically, it's when the intracranial pressure in the whole skull builds up so much that the brain herniates downwards, and the tonsils squeeze out through the foramen magnum, and it compresses the brainstem and compresses the spinal cord, and your patient dies. Really don't want that. You really don't want that. And the one thing that can cause coning is if you're taking a lumbar puncture and the intracranial pressure is really high, but you didn't realize and you take it and it fucks it up. Don't do that. Always check intracranial pressure before you take a lumbar puncture. Now, the rest of them kind of just makes sense. You don't really need to know that much about them. Transcalvarial through the calvarium, which is the skull. Transtentorial means it's going from above the tentorium to below the tentorium. Transtentorial. And the difference between that and a tonsillar is mostly that it really brings down the lobes of the brain, like your parietal and temporal lobes are coming down, whereas tonsillar, it doesn't necessarily, the rest of the brain doesn't have to come with it. Like it can sometimes just be the tonsils of the brain. And uncal herniation is just caused that because the uncus is what is herniating. Not super high yield. So next up, we're going to talk a little bit about the dural venous sinuses. Just lightly, we're just going to follow its pathway and see where they all sit because it looks a little bit complicated. So let's come back over here and take a look at our dural venous sinuses. So let's bring back our sagittal sinus. There we go, our superior sagittal sinus. So if we get rid of the dura and the brain, we can see where the dural venous sinuses sit. So these sit in between the folds of the falx cerebri, and this one sits on top. So you have your superior sagittal sinus and your inferior sagittal sinus. And then if you look around here and we remove the tentorium cerebelli, you can see the transverse sinus working its way around there. And actually towards the front here, they feed into the cavernous sinus. Now, something that blew my mind is the fact that there is a right and a left cavernous sinus. There's not just one. You have one on that side, you have the intercavernous sinus, and then you have another one on the other side. I don't know if that's mind-blowing for everyone, but it was for me. I may just be a little stupid, but there are two cavernous sinuses. Let's remember that. And of course, that's a really important structure, and you can see your trigeminal nerve and all your other nerves passing through and around your cavernous sinus there. And then it all eventually flows out via your internal jugular vein. So if we highlight the drainage path, there it is, your internal jugular vein. And if we remove some more of this, you can see where that drains out via the sigmoid sinus down there. So we have superior and inferior sagittals, transverse. We have our little ones around here, that's the petrosal sinus, and it all drains into the sigmoid sinus around the corner, and then eventually down the internal jugular vein, which exits through the jugular foramen in the skull. Cool. So I hope that helps a little bit with the orientation of all those sinuses. They're not super high yield, but they are quite confusing to look at. So next up, we're going to be talking about the Circle of Willis. Now, this is super important. The Circle of Willis will come back time and time again. People get strokes. You need to know about the Circle of Willis. It's really important. Except I hate this picture. I look at this and I'm like, why is it flat? The brain isn't a dinner plate. Like, what? How does this connect anywhere? There's no depth. And this doesn't just sit there, does it? The answer is no, it doesn't just sit there. It actually has a 3D shape that is incredibly hard to conceptualize on a 2D picture. So let us take a look. So the Circle of Willis. So if we position it right here, so we are looking from a posterior view. So we are posterior looking anteriorly. And this doesn't look too different from this. We have our anterior cerebral arteries here and here. We have our middle cerebral artery and our posterior cerebral artery. And then we have our anterior communicating artery, our posterior communicating arteries, and your basilar artery, which gives rise to a lot of pontine arteries because they supply the pons of the brainstem. And that all looks fairly normal. But as soon as you turn it sideways, suddenly it's not quite a perfect circle anymore, is it? So the circle is definitely still there, of course, but I thought this was crazy when I first saw it. So it's quite a 3D structure, especially with your internal carotids being quite wiggly wavy. And this in particular, I found interesting because it perfectly cups the pons. Like it really just comes around perfectly cups the pons. And all of this is a lot further forward in the brain than I ever thought. I think because the vertebral arteries are here, I thought it's in the back, like it's probably the base of your skull. But if we put everything back into context, and bring all the other structures back, we are sitting quite far forward in the brain. So especially with our pituitary sitting right there, you can really tell that we are fully like in the middle to anterior cranial fossa. So let's just take a good look here at where we are. So the vertebral arteries come up through the spine, the transverse processes of the spine, and then they come up in front of the brainstem and work their way up along the pons, where it will give off a whole bunch of branches. And then these are your posterior branches, go to posterior of the brain. Your middle branches really do go to the middle of the head, and then your anteriors going upwards towards this area. And then you have your internal carotids that come up, go and wiggle around the cavernous sinus. They pierce through the cavernous sinus and then come up to join the Circle of Willis. Now, the important thing about this is imagine you are a little blood clot that has made its way up from the heart, really keen to cause a stroke. So you make your way up around the internal carotid, and when you get here, let's take a look at this. Where from here is the easiest way to go? Realistically, yes, you could go anywhere. You could go along the posterior communicating artery and go to the PCA. You could go along the anterior cerebral arteries. But look how easy it is to just continue around the MCA there. And this is why MCA strokes are so common, because it is just the path of least resistance for clots. And unfortunately, MCA strokes can cause a whole bunch of different things. So the MCA vascularizes a lot of brain structures. So let's chat about that. So just a reminder, this is your ACA territories, your MCA territories, and your PCA territories. So really, most of your brain is done by the MCA. When we're talking about watershed areas here, we're talking about the areas where the collaterals of these branches, of these big vessels, kind of don't really do as much as they should. these are the very vulnerable areas where they are just collaterally vascularized by branches of the ACA, branches of the MCA, but not a whole bunch of either. And if you have a stroke or you lose vascularization to that area for even a little bit, it like dies immediately. It's really bad. We can even take a look at some of these branches. We come back to our basic circle of Willis and bring in some of these branches. And there are a lot. There's a couple there, and there are some more there. And as you can see, these areas would get some innervation, but sorry, not innervation, would get some blood supply, but ultimately not very great blood supply. So that is where some watershed infarcts can be really bad. Sorry about that little tangent, but then we can talk about if you have a stroke in any of these territories, what kind of functions do you lose? So this is a very basic table. This is very broad. It's not very specific, but this is just kind of a, if you remember nothing else, this is what you remember. So your anterior cerebral artery, it does basically your frontal lobe as well as the internal capsule of the brain, or your funky stuff in the middle, like your basal ganglia and stuff. And the real main symptom you see is loss of sensation of the lower limb. Now, if you remember funky homunculus man, where the homunculus is the post-central gyrus. So if we take a look at the brain, this gyrus right here, if you took this gyrus, sliced down either side of it, that slice of brain is your sensory cortex. It is the homunculus, which you've seen, like the funny guy with all his hands and arms and stuff. That is going along the distribution of that. So the inside of it is actually innervated by the ACA because it's, on the inside. MCA doesn't want to touch there. And all of that is your lower limb. Your legs, your feet, all of that is located on this part of the sulcus. The rest of it, your face, your arms, your upper body, is on the rest of this gyrus. Sorry, not sulcus. So if your ACA is affected, you'll lose sensation in the lower limb because that's all that it gives blood supply to. But if it happens to the MCA, suddenly you lose the entire rest of your homunculus and you can't feel your upper limb. It may affect your face, your torso, every other part of your body, because that is the distribution of the homunculus. Other things that may happen if you have an MCA stroke, because it does supply most of your temporal and parietal lobes, is you can have changes in vision because your optic radiations go to those lobes. You'll have changes in speech because your Broca's and Wernicke's areas are also in those areas. And you can also have difficulties with movement due to your precentral gyrus and your primary motor cortex also being located in the temporal and parietal lobes, which is here, your precentral gyrus. And finally, the PCA, just remember it's the occipital lobe and vision. Like that is all I remember, and that's all I've needed. Finally, we're just going to talk a little bit about the anatomy of the brainstem, because a lot of us, I feel, look at the brainstem, know about the brainstem, but don't actually know what it looks like. Like, look at, what is this? It looks like some sort of weird embryo. I don't know why is that in my head? So let us take a final look at the brainstem. So this is the brainstem, and this is what it looks like with the brain there, of course. And I think we'll just take a closer look. Let's hide everything else. Okay. So to start off with, we have the pons, the medulla, sorry, the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. So what we have here is actually a little bit more than the midbrain. Out here, we have the thalami and we have the hypothalamus, as well as the pituitary gland on the stalk. So that's a little bit extra, but mostly this is the midbrain, the pons, and this whole bit here is the medulla. Now let's talk through a couple of key structures of the brainstem. So on the back here, we'll start with the medulla. We have our gracile tubercle and cuneate tubercle. Now these two are part of your dorsal columns. Now the gracile tubercle does sensation of the lower body, and the cuneate tubercle does sensation of the upper limb. So the way I like to remember it is, imagine you're standing there with your arms straight down your body next to your legs. Your hands, your arms will fall outside of your legs. So if imagine these as arms and these as legs, that is what it innervates, essentially. So we have those four at the back there. And coming along to the front, we have the olives and we have the pyramids. So the olives will become important later. It's just a bit of a landmark. The pyramids, though, they are quite important. They carry the corticospinal and corticobulbar tracts, so all your motor things. And you'll hear quite often that, something decussates at the pyramidal level. These are the pyramids. This is where it decussates. This is the place. So yeah. Then we move on to the pons. It's this big one here. And really it's just a whole bunch of white matter. And also where cranial nerves come out of. So some key structures on the back here would be the peduncles. So it looks like one thing, but it's actually three. You have your superior peduncle, your middle cerebellar peduncle, and your inferior cerebellar peduncle. Now just take note that these are cerebellar peduncles, not cerebral peduncles. Because if you imagine, the cerebellum actually sits right in there. Yep. And now we'll move on to the midbrain. A couple of important structures you can see here are your superior and inferior colliculi. Your superior colliculi mostly do vision-related things, and your inferior colliculi do mostly hearing and ear auditory-related things. I guess you can think of, I don't know, are your eyes higher up than your ears? Kind of, a little bit. So the eyes are above your ears. Superior does eyes, inferior does ears. Good enough. I've heard worse. Now, finally, we will bring back everything so we can see it in context. And we can see the cerebellum is right there, which is why they're called the cerebellar peduncles. And we can see some cranial nerves making their way back there. And finally, I think we will bring back some cranial. Oh dear Lord, I am sorry. I'm sorry this has happened. Let's ignore that and just take a look at where these cranial nerves are coming from. As you can see here, when I was talking about the olive, here is the olive. And an important thing is that we have all these cranial nerves that come out from behind the olive. You have the glossopharyngeal nerve, vagus nerve, and the accessory nerve. So 9, 10, and 11 all come out from behind the olive, but cranial nerve 12 actually comes out from in front of the olive. And that is something that's come up in exams before. So the olive is a very important landmark. And just remember that 12 is the only one in front. All the others are behind it. And then you have your other cranial nerves that come out from the midline and making their way around. You have our facial nerve. Like all three of these are in a row here. So that's 7 and 8. Coming out from the pontomedullary junction, angle, this area here, right in between the two. We have our abducens nerve, and then further up we have our other cranial nerves, like our oculomotor nerve. So that has been a bit of a basic rundown of some neuroanatomy, a little bit of clinical knowledge. I hope that was useful and not just me rambling for a little bit. Please let us know if you want to see any other videos or are confused about any other bits of anatomy that you would like us to go through. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.